The siren had already been screaming for 9 seconds when the old beagle decided it wasn't worth getting up for. I know it was 9 seconds because the concourse board over the diner door counts the breech klaxon out loud, in that flat ship voice the station uses for everything. And I had just finished wiping the same patch of counter for the fourth time when the count tripped over from 8 to 9. Behind me, sprawled in the warm strip of light under the grill vent, Marbles lifted his head off his paws, took the whole panicking world in with one slow blink, and put his head back down. That was the thing the quartermaster had logged as surplus weight. A 14-year-old beagle with a gray muzzle and one ear that didn't fold right, who slept 20 hours of every 28 and ate his weight in reconstituted protein every fortnight, and who, with a hull breach alarm going off directly above his skull, could not be bothered to stand. I should back up because the panic is the part that matters, and the panic hadn't started in earnest yet. It started about 4 seconds after Marbles put his head down, when the first of the Velt cracked. The Velt are tall. I'd been serving them across that counter for 2 years by then, and I still hadn't gotten used to how tall, 7-8 feet of pale segmented limb, narrow through the body, like something built for standing in shallow water, with those big lidless eyes set wide on the sides of a head that swiveled instead of turned. Good customers mostly, quiet tippers. They liked the way I did the brine grain because it reminded them of something from home they wouldn't name, and they were, every single one of them, absolutely terrified of enclosed spaces with no visible exit, which is a problem. When the breech klaxon sounds and the bulkhead doors come down, the concourse on Tertian Way Station is a long curved canyon of a place, 40 meters of polished deck under a vaulted ceiling, lined with shops and galleys and ticket kiosks, and at both ends of it sat the heavy pressure doors that drop when the station thinks a section's about to lose air. They drop now. I heard the far one go first, a deep iron cough, and then the boom of its seating, and then ours, the near one, 40 meters down the concourse, slammed home and sealed us in. 200 people in a sealed tube with a klaxon telling them they're about to die. About 60 of them were Velt. I have never heard a sound like the one the Velt make when they panic, and I hope I never do again. It isn't a scream exactly. It's lower than a scream, and it comes from somewhere in the body cavity, a kind of fluttering moan that they can't control and that sets off the next one and the next, so that, within about a breath, the whole length of the concourse was filled with it, this rising drone, and the tall, pale bodies were starting to move, not toward anything, just away, away from the walls, away from each other, toward the center and then back, a herd looking for an edge that wasn't there. You learn fast, running a counter, that a panicking crowd doesn't think. It flows, and it flows toward whatever's lowest and softest, which on a concourse means it flows over the small things. The loon folk, who come up about waist high on me and run their little freight brokerage 2 doors down, were already getting knocked sideways. Somebody's cargo cart went over. A kiosk display cracked. I'd lived through a real decompression once, years before I ever came out here, back when I still wore a uniform and thought I'd die in it. I knew the klaxon. I knew the difference between the rising tone that means run and the steady tone that means hold, and I knew this one I'd had time in the 9 seconds to actually listen was the steady one. A sensor fault or a slow leak 2 sections over, or a drill nobody'd warned us about. Not a hull coming apart, not the thing the Velt thought it was. But you can't tell that to a herd. I tried. I came around the end of the counter with both hands up and my flat order up voice on, the one that cuts through a lunch rush, and I called out that it was holding, it was steady, nobody was venting, and I might as well have been talking to the weather. The drone swallowed it. A Velt 3 meters away went up onto the points of its long feet and came down hard, and a loon child screamed somewhere under the noise. And I understood with a cold drop in my stomach that this was going to crush somebody before the doors ever opened. That the alarm wasn't the danger. The room was the danger, and I had no way to reach into it and slow it down. That's when Marbles got up. He didn't hurry. He never hurried for anything in his life except the sound of the protein canister seal, and that one time, a thrown ball that he carried around for a week afterward like a trophy. He got his old legs under him the way he did every evening when he wanted out, a slow unfolding, front first, then the long stretch with his rear in the air and his tail going in a lazy half circle, and he yawned a big, wet, unbothered beagle yawn with a little squeak at the end of it. And then he walked out from under the grill vent into the middle of the screaming concourse like a man stepping out his own front door to check the weather. I want to be honest about what I felt, because it wasn't pride yet. It was fear. He was an old dog, and the deck was a churning mass of panicking giants, and I thought plainly in those words, they're going to trample him. I started after him. I got one hand out, and then the nearest Velt looked down and saw him and stopped, not slowed. Stopped. One instant a tower of fluttering, moaning panic, the next a thing gone completely still, All those wide, lidless eyes locked down at the small great dog padding unhurried across the deck, and the moan died in its throat with an audible click. I have replayed that click 1,000 times. It was the sound of an animal that has been screaming about a wolf in the dark suddenly being shown, very calmly, exactly where the wolf is, and discovering that the wolf is bored. It rippled outward from there. The stillness, I mean. The velt that had stopped was a kind of stone dropped in the drone, and the ones nearest it caught the silence off it the way you catch a yawn, and went still too, swiveling their heads down to find what the first one was staring at. And what they found was Marbles, in the exact center of the concourse now, sitting down. He sat the way he always sat, heavily, a little crookedly, with his bad leg out to the side, and he looked up at the ring of giants gathering, around him with the open, faintly hopeful expression of a dog who suspects somebody up there might have food. His tail swept the deck once, twice. The klaxon was still counting, the doors were still down, and 60 Velt, who had been one breath from stampeding a child to death on the polished floor, stood frozen in a widening circle, staring at a beagle, because every instinct they had was screaming a thing that overrode the alarm entirely. I didn't understand it then. I understood the effect. The noise was draining out of the concourse like water out of a basin, the drone breaking up into individual ragged breaths and then into something close to quiet, but I didn't understand the why, and I didn't get the why until later from the station's own people, who'd had to write a report about it. What I did in the moment was the only thing I know how to do when a room goes strange on me. I kept moving like nothing was strange. I walked out to my dog the way I'd walk out to wipe a table, knelt down next to him on one knee in the middle of all those staring giants, and put my hand on his back. His fur was warm from the grill vent. I could feel his heart going under my palm, slow even, an old dog's idling engine, not one beat faster than it had been when he was asleep. "You're all right," I told him, which was for me, not for him. A velt near the front lowered itself. They don't kneel, their legs don't work that way, but it folded down at the long middle joints until its terrible wide head was nearly level with the dog, and it made a sound at him. Not the moan. A different sound, a soft clicking flutter, almost a question. Marbles regarded it for a moment. Then he leaned over and very deliberately sniffed the thing's face, the way he sniffed everyone, jowls swinging, and gave it one slow, considering wag. The velt straightened up and turned to the others and made a long string of the clicking sound, and whatever it said, the last of the panic went out of the concourse with it. The drone was gone. People were breathing. A loon child was crying somewhere, but it was the ordinary crying of a child who'd been frightened and was now just upset, the best sound in the world after the other one. The klaxon counted to its end. The steady tone held 3 more beats and then cut off, and the silence after it was enormous. A station voice came on, bored and bureaucratic, and announced that the alert in Section 9 had been resolved, a coolant sensor had faulted, there had been no breach. The doors would cycle open in 90 seconds. The station regretted the inconvenience and reminded passengers that the Galleria's retail spaces remained open. 90 seconds. The thing that had nearly killed people had been a faulty sensor in a count of 90 seconds. And the only reason the count hadn't ended over a pile of trampled bodies was an old beagle who decided, somewhere in the middle of it, that the room needed him to go sit down. I stayed on one knee with my hand on him until the doors came up. People filed out around us, careful now, the velt giving the dog a wide, respectful berth as they went, several of them folding down at the joints as they passed to make that soft clicking sound at him, which Marbles received with the patience of a king who finds his subjects tiresome but tolerable. I gathered him up, he let me, which he didn't always, and carried him back to his strip of warm light under the vent, and he was asleep again before I'd finished setting out the chairs the herd had knocked over. I figured that was the end of it. A bad afternoon, a near thing, a dog who'd gotten lucky standing in the right place. I'm a cook. I don't read reports. It took the station 3 days to come find me and explain that I had it exactly backward. The first one through the door was a velt I knew, Sosh, who ran the customs desk on the inbound side and ate my brine grain twice a week and over, tipped because he could never get the human gratuity math right. He came in alone before the lunch rush, and he stood in the doorway folding and unfolding his long fingers, which I'd learned was the velt version of working up to something hard. "Mr. Voss," he said. The translator gave it to me flat, but Sosh's own voice under it was doing something complicated. "I wish to ask about your animal." "He's asleep," I said. "He's usually asleep." Sosh swiveled his head toward the grill vent, toward the gray heap of dog, and something went through his whole tall body, a kind of suppressed shudder that I'd have called fear in a human. "We have been," he said, "in meetings about what happened. There is a question on the report that I drew the duty to ask you, and I find I do not wish to ask it, but I will." He folded his fingers again. "Did you train him to do that?" I laughed before I could stop myself. Shosh, that dog can't be trained to come when I call him. If there's a smell he likes better. He's 14, he sleeps. I didn't train him to do anything. He got up because, and there I stopped because I genuinely did not know why he'd gotten up. I don't know why he got up, I admitted. I figured he was scared too and wanted to be near me. Sosh was quiet for a long moment. Out in the concourse, a cart rattled past. Then he said, very carefully, he was not scared. That is the entire matter, Mr. Voss. In a sealed room, with the breach signal sounding, with 60 of my people losing their minds, he was the only living thing in that concourse who was not afraid, and we could all smell it. I poured Sosh a brine grain he hadn't ordered and sat down across from him because I could tell this was going to be a sitting-down conversation. He explained it the way a careful man explains something he's still afraid of. The Velt, he said, came from a world of tides and predators, a flat, wet world where the worst thing that could happen to you was to be caught in a closing space with the water rising and no high ground in sight. Their whole nervous system was wired around that one nightmare. The breech klaxon, the ceiling doors, the windowless tube of the concourse. To a Velt, that wasn't an inconvenience. It was the literal shape of death they'd been born dreading. And when it came, the oldest part of the brain took the wheel, and the screaming started and could not be stopped by reason, by training, by anything. They had a word for the state. The translator wouldn't render it. Sosh said it raw, a wet clicking thing, and shuddered again, saying it. There is no governing it, he said. We have tried. For as long as we have had ships, we have tried, and it ends careers, it ends lives. Every few years, a sealed compartment kills its own people in the panic before the danger ever reaches them. It is the great shame of my species, Mr. Voss, the thing we do not speak of to outsiders, and there is only one thing that has ever broken it. He turned his head toward Marbles, a calm older animal, in the room, unafraid. He told me how it worked, or as much as anyone understood. The Velt read fear in others below the level of thought. Chemically, in the air, the way I might smell smoke. A frightened crowd is a feedback loop. Every panicking body pumps the panic scent, and every other body breathes it in and panics harder, and there's no bottom to it. But put one creature in the middle of that loop who is genuinely bone-deep unafraid, not pretending, not bravely controlling it, but actually stupidly calm, a calm that the chemical can't fake, and the loop has something to break against. The scent of that calm cuts through the scent of the fear. The oldest part of the brain, the part that took the wheel, recognizes it. Somebody here is not afraid, which means the closing space is not death, which means I can come down. On our ships, Sosh said, we keep a beast for it, a slow old thing bred over generations to be calm in sealed spaces. We call it the translator hunted, gave up, settled on the anchor. A ship without an anchor does not carry passengers, and good anchors are rare and old and we lose them, and the breeding is failing, and the last 3 crossings before I took this posting, I rode ships with no anchor at all, and I did not sleep the entire way. He looked at me. Do you understand what I am telling you? We sat in the meeting and we watched the deck footage 40 times. 60 of us in the killing state, past all reason. And your animal walked out into the center of it and sat down and yawned, and the smell of him, the absolute calm of him, an old creature in a sealed room with the death signal screaming and not one part of him caring. It reached us where nothing else can reach us. He brought the whole concourse down. One small gray animal who you tell me you did not even train. He wanted his nap back, I said. That's the honest truth of it. He got up, did his business, and he's been asleep ever since. Sosh made the soft clicking sound, and I'd learned enough of him to know it was the Velt equivalent of a man putting his face in his hands. Yes, he said, and that is why it works. An anchor that was trained, that was trying to be calm, we would smell the effort. The effort is a kind of fear. Your animal was not trying. Your animal was bored. There is no counterfeit for that. We have spent 1,000 years trying to breed for what your beagle does by being too old and too lazy to be bothered. I looked over at Marbles. He'd rolled onto his back in his sleep with his legs in the air and his bad ear flopped inside out, and he was snoring the small wet snore that had kept me company through more lonely station nights than I cared to count. He's not for sale, I said. I don't know why it came out of me right then. Sosh hadn't asked, but I'd felt the shape of the question coming and I wanted it dead before it arrived. I'll say that now so nobody has to dance around it. Whatever he is to you people, he's my dog, and he's old, and he's going to sleep under that vent until the day he doesn't wake up, and then I'm going to bury him somewhere with dirt in it if it's the last thing I do out here. He's not a piece of equipment. Sosh was quiet. Then he did something I'd never seen a Velt do. He folded all the way down at the joints, down and down, until that great pale head was below the level of the table, below mine, and he held it there. I did not come to buy him, he said from down by the floor. I came to apologize to him and to you. We have a record, Mr. Voss, of every living thing that comes through this station, and it is the duty of the customs desk to assign each one a category, And 2 years ago, when you arrived, I was the officer who processed you and your animal, and I entered him under the heading we use for things that consume station resources without producing labor. He came up slowly. I logged your dog as surplus weight. I wrote it with my own hand. Cargo. A drain on the manifest. I have thought about that every hour since the meeting, and I needed you to know that I know what I missed and that I am ashamed. I didn't know what to do with an apology that big from a man 8 feet tall, so I did what I always do, which is I got up and made food. I brought him another brine grain, a plate of the grilled root he liked, and I told him to sit up and eat it, and after a while he did, and the worst of the stiffness went out of the room. But Sash wasn't the end of it. Sash was the start, because the report didn't stay in the meeting. A sealed compartment incident on a Velt traffic station with a no-casualty resolution is apparently a rare enough thing that it goes up the chain, and the chain on Tertian had a lot of links, and over the next 2 weeks I watched the consequences of my dog's nap roll downhill onto my diner one delegation at a time. The Port Authority came first, a cluster of them, Velt and Loon, and one of the squat armored Thren who handle station security, and they wanted to look at the footage with me and ask me to walk them through what I'd done. I told them I hadn't done anything. I told them 4 times. They kept watching the part where I knelt down and put my hand on him, rewinding it, conferring, and finally the Thren security officer said, in the gravel the translator gave them, "You touched it. In the center of the event, you placed your hand upon the anchor and remained beside it. This is a protocol." "It's not a protocol," I said. "It's my dog and I was worried about him." "We will call it a protocol," the Thren said, with the flat finality of someone closing a file, and I understood there was no arguing with a creature that had found a procedure it liked. Then came the medical people wanted to know whether the effect could be bottled, whether they could synthesize whatever it was Marbles put into the air and spray it through the vents in an emergency. I said I had no idea and that he was a dog, not a perfume factory. They asked, very delicately, whether they might collect samples. I asked what kind of samples. They said fur, primarily, and bedding, and if I was willing, the contents of and I told them they could have fur off his brush and not one thing more, and they took the brush hair like it was a holy relic, 2 of them holding the sample tube while a third recorded the transfer, and they bowed to the dog on the way out. Marbles slept through all of it. What got me, though, what stayed with me, was the smaller traffic, not the delegations, the ones who came in alone. A Velt freighter pilot, off a long inbound haul, who'd heard the story at the customs desk and walked the length of the concourse to my door just to stand near the dog for a while. She didn't ask me anything. She bought a brine grain she didn't eat, and she sat at the counter end nearest the grill vent, where Marbles slept, and she breathed slow and deliberate. And after about 20 minutes, the tension went out of her long frame, and she thanked me in a voice the translator couldn't quite keep level and left. Then another, then a few a day. Velt, who were about to ride out on a ship with no anchor, coming to sit by an old beagle and store up an hour of his calm against the sealed dark ahead of them, the way a man might say a prayer he doesn't fully believe before a hard crossing. I started keeping the stool by the vent clear for them. I never charged for the sitting. It felt wrong to charge for it. Marbles, for his part, registered none of it. He was a beagle. The pilgrims who came to sit in the radius of his peace were to him a series of large warm presences who occasionally smelled interesting and once in a while, if he played his cards right, dropped a piece of grilled root. He accepted their reverence the way he accepted everything. The alarm, the giants, the apology, the relic keepers taking his brush hair, with the supreme indifference of an animal who had long ago concluded that the universe was a place that brought food and warmth and the occasional walk, and that everything beyond those 3 facts was somebody else's business. There's a thing Sash said to me near the end of all the fuss that I've held on to. He'd come in late one evening after his shift, and we were the only 2 in the place, and Marbles was doing his evening unfold over by the vent, the slow front first stretch and the rear in the air and the squeaking yawn, getting himself organized to go out. Sash watched him do it with an expression I'd stopped trying to read on a Velt face but had come by then to understand anyway. "You're kind," he said. "You truly do not know what you carry, do you? You walk our concourses with the thing we have feared the dark for 1,000 years to find, and you have it sleeping under a grill, and you call it surplus weight." He clicked softly. "We sent our whole science at the killing state. Drugs, surgery, 1,000 years of breeding. And the answer, the actual answer, was an old animal too content to be afraid, sitting down in the middle of the room. You had the answer in your laps the entire time, and you did not even know it was an answer. You thought it was a pet." "He is a pet," I said. "Yes," Sash said. "That is the part we cannot get past. It would have stayed a strange, sweet footnote in the life of a frontier diner, I think, if the second alarm hadn't been real. It came at the back end of a long shift, maybe 6 weeks after the first one, with the concourse full, a transfer rush, 2 big liners crossing through Tertian at once, the place packed shoulder to shoulder with every species the route carried. I was buried in tickets, both grills going, when the board over the door stopped counting in the board's steady tone and started counting in the other. One. The rising one. The one I knew from the worst day of my younger life. The one that means run. I want to be precise about this, because it matters. The first time the alarm was false and the room was the only danger. The second time the alarm was true and the room and the danger were going to arrive together. A coupling had failed on the outbound liner, still mated to the station. A real failure. Propellant venting into the transfer gallery one section over, a fire suppression system that hadn't engaged, the actual cascading nightmare the klaxon was built to warn about. The station did exactly what it was supposed to do. It sealed every door on the ring, and it sealed 240 people into the concourse with a rising tone alarm and a wall, a section over, that had perhaps 4 minutes in it before something behind it gave. The Velt, and there were a lot of Velt, it was a Velt-heavy route, went into the killing state almost instantly, and this time I understood what I was watching. This time I didn't waste my breath telling the room it was steady, because it wasn't steady, it was the worst it could be, and a crowd that big in that state with a true threat coming would not leave a small thing alive on that deck. The drone went up. The tall, pale bodies began to move. A railing buckled. I came around my counter already knowing it wasn't going to be enough this time, that one old dog couldn't reach a panic this size, that the radius of his calm had limits and this was past them. And I was wrong about that too, but not in the way I'd have guessed, because Marbles was already up. He'd felt me move, maybe, or felt the change in the air, and he was already on his feet and already walking, that same unhurried evening walk amble, out from under the vent into the churn. But this time he didn't make for the center. This time, and I have no explanation for it, I will go to my grave with no explanation for it. He turned and made straight for the worst of it, for the knot of Velt jammed up against the sealed door at the venting end, the ones nearest the real danger and the deepest into the state, where the crush was already starting to put bodies down. I went after him. I had to shove through a forest of panicking giants to do it, and I caught up to him at the very edge of the knot, and I did the only thing left to me. I scooped him up off the deck and held him against my chest, his old heart going slow and even under my hand, and I pushed in toward the door, toward the people in the worst of it, holding the dog up where they could see him and smell him, the way you'd hold up a lantern. What happened then I've never been able to describe to anyone who wasn't there. The nearest Velt saw him, saw the small, gray, unbothered animal carried into the heart of their terror, blinking, jowls swinging, supremely uninterested in the alarm, screaming 6 inches over his head. And it stopped. And the stopping caught the next one, and the next, and it spread back through the crush from the door, this wave of stillness rolling out against the wave of panic, the two meeting somewhere in the middle of the concourse, and the panic, breaking, coming apart, the drone dissolving into ragged individual breaths, then into a silence so sudden and total that I could hear, for the first time, the actual hiss of the propellant venting in the gallery one section over, a sound like the whole station holding its breath. I stood there with my dog held up over my head in a sealed room full of giants who had stopped being afraid, and the alarm kept counting, and the wall held, and the station's emergency crews got the suppression online from the far side with about 40 seconds to spare, and the rising tone dropped to steady, and the steady tone held, and then it cut off and the doors came up. Nobody died. In a true coupling breach with a failed suppressor and 240 bodies sealed into a tube, nobody died, and nobody was even seriously hurt. And the after-action report, I read this one, they made sure I got a copy, said in its flat official language that casualties were prevented by the maintenance of crowd cohesion during the sealed interval, and that crowd cohesion had been maintained by, and here the report used a phrase I've kept, by the presence of a calming auxiliary asset. A calming auxiliary asset, that was my beagle. Held up over my head like a lantern in the dark while a station tried to come apart, and 160 Velt found. In the smell of one old dog who couldn't be bothered to be afraid, the one thing 1,000 years of their own science had never managed to give them. I carried him back to his vent. My arms were shaking by then, though not from his weight. He weighed nothing. He was old and light as a bundle of sticks. I set him down in the warm strip of light, and he turned around twice and lay down and was asleep before the crews had finished venting the gallery, and I sat down on the floor next to him, with my back against the counter, and I stayed there a long time, in the emptying concourse, with my hand on his side, feeling the old engine idle. After the second one, they stopped pretending it was a footnote. The Velt have a thing. Sosh walked me through it carefully. because he wanted me to understand it wasn't a transaction that's older than their ships and older than their writing, a status they accord to the rare animals that can break the killing state. It isn't ownership. It's closer to what we'd call sanctuary, or maybe stewardship in reverse. The animal isn't kept, it's guarded, and the household that has the honor of housing one takes on a duty that the whole people enforce. An anchor cannot be bought, cannot be taken, cannot be made to work. It can only be allowed to be near. And the privilege of allowing it carries an obligation that runs the other way, from the people to the keeper. The keeper feeds it, shelters it, and asks nothing. And in return, the people see to it that the keeper never wants for anything the rest of their life. I didn't ask for that. I want to be clear, because there are versions of this story going around the route now that have me as some kind of operator who saw an angle, and that's not how it went. I told them repeatedly that he was an old dog and I was a cook, and I didn't want a status. What I wanted was to be left alone to run my counter and let my dog sleep. They overrode me, gently but completely. A creature that found a procedure it liked all over again, except now it was a whole species. The diner doesn't pay station fees anymore. I tried to pay them, and the Port Authority sent the credits back with a note that the assessment had been waived, in perpetuity by accord, and when I went down to argue about it, the Thren officer behind the desk looked at me for a long moment and said, "You are the keeper of an anchor. We do not bill the keeper of an anchor. Do not come here again about this." And that was the end of that. The protein I was buying at Frontier Markup, the stuffed marbles ate his weight of every fortnight. A Velt agricultural concern started shipping it to my door for free, the good kind, the kind I couldn't have afforded, with a little folded note in the first crate that the translator rendered as, "For the calm one, with the gratitude of those who cross the dark." I read that note standing in my own doorway and had to go inside for a minute. And the sitters kept coming, more of them now. The stool by the vent was never empty. I had to put in a second one. Velt off the long hauls, and then not just Velt, a few of the loon who it turned out had their own version of the dread, milder, and a Thren once, which I'd never have believed a Thren capable of, the squat armored security people. But there he was one slow afternoon, folded down as small as a Thren gets, sitting in the radius of an old beagle's piece with his gauntlets in his lap and his eyes closed. None of them ever touched him without asking me, and I never let anyone wake him, and they never tried. That was the unspoken rule of the place. The anchor sleeps. You may sit near the anchor and breathe, and you may, if he comes to you, let him sniff your hand, and you may leave a piece of grilled root where he'll find it, but you do not wake the anchor. You do not need the anchor. You do not make the anchor work. The whole arrangement ran on the one thing that made him work in the first place, that nobody ever asked anything of him. The moment you needed him, Sash had told me, the moment the calm became a performance, it would stop being real, and the Velt would smell the falseness, and the whole thing would collapse. So we left him alone. A diner full of the galaxy's most fearful travelers, organized entirely around the principle of letting one old dog be lazy in peace. I'll tell you the part that I think about most, though, the part that isn't about the Velt at all. It's that I almost didn't bring him. When I mustered out and took the Frontier galley posting, 2 years before any of this, the personnel officer, a human, this was still on the Earth side, looked at the line on my intake form where I'd listed a dependent and said, "You're bringing a 14-year-old dog to a deep route way station. You understand he probably doesn't make the trip. You understand if he does make it, he doesn't last long out there. The medical's expensive and the cargo allowance for an animal that age, frankly, the math doesn't work. Most people in your situation would do the kind thing here and not put him through it." The kind thing. He meant put him down. He said it gently. The way Sash would later say surplus weight gently. The way everyone who has ever looked at an old animal and seen a cost on a manifest says it gently, and he wasn't wrong about the math. The math didn't work. An old dog is a drain. He produces no labor. He consumes resources. By every measure a manifest can hold, the personnel officer was right, and I should have done the kind thing and gone out into the dark unencumbered. I told him no. I didn't have a reason that would fit on a form. I had a 14-year-old beagle who'd slept against my back through the worst nights of a uniformed life I was trying to leave behind, and the idea of doing the kind thing made me want to put my fist through his desk. And so I paid the cargo markup I couldn't afford, and I brought my surplus weight out into the dark with me, because he was mine and he was old and I wasn't going to leave him on the wrong side of it. And 2 years later, that surplus weight was the only thing standing between 240 people and a stampede over their own bodies. Twice. I'm not a man who believes in much. I cooked, I served my hitch before that. I buried a marriage and a couple of friends along the way, and I came out the far side of all of it, fairly sure the universe doesn't keep books. But I've thought a great deal these last months about how close I came to listening to the personnel officer, and about everything that would have ridden out into the dark on those ships with no anchor and come apart in some sealed compartment 1,000 light years from here, all because the math said an old dog was a drain. The math is very good at telling you what a thing costs. It has never once, in my experience, had the first idea what a thing is worth. The trouble, when it came in a good suit. His name was Administrator Reln, and he was Velt, and he was nothing like Sash. Where Sash folded his fingers when he was working up to something hard, Reln held himself perfectly still, which I came to learn was worse. He arrived without an appointment one morning with 2 aides and a Threnin and Fleet, colors a step behind him, and he didn't sit at the counter and he didn't order anything. He stood in the middle of my diner with his hands behind his back and looked at the sleeping dog under the grill vent the way a man looks at a resource he intends to allocate. "Mr. Voss," he said, "I represent the crossing authority. You will be aware that your animal has been classified as an anchor under the old accord. I am here about the matter of its proper deployment." I'd been a long time out here by then, and I knew the sound of a man who'd already decided the thing and come to inform you of it. I dried my hands and came around the counter and stood between him and the dog, which I didn't plan, I just found myself doing. "He's not deployed," I said. "He sleeps under that vent. People come and sit with him. That's the whole operation." "Yes," Reln said, "and that is the inefficiency I am here to correct." He had a way of talking that made everything sound already decided. An anchor sitting idle in a galley on a frontier station serves perhaps 40 travelers a day, by passive exposure, by accident, placed aboard a vessel on the deep crossings. Properly housed, properly managed, rotated across the worst routes, it could secure thousands. The crossings to the rim run without anchors entirely. People ride them in terror. Some do not arrive sane. We have here in your possession a functioning anchor of exceptional quality, and it is being squandered on the comfort of a coffee line. The authority proposes to take custody and deploy it where the need is greatest. You will, of course, be compensated, generously. I looked at him for a while. Behind me, Marbles snored. "No," I said, "Mr. Voss. I want to make sure I'm understanding you," I said. "Before we go any further, you want to take a 14-year-old dog off the one warm vent he's got and ship him out onto the worst routes in the sector, rotated, you said, route to route, sealed compartment to sealed compartment, for the rest of his life, so he can be afraid for strangers on your behalf. That's the proposal." "He would not be afraid," Reln said. "That is the entire point of an anchor. He does not." "He'd be afraid," I said. "Maybe not of the alarm. He doesn't understand the alarm. But he's an old dog and he understands his vent and his counter and his man, and you take those away and ship him out into a thing he doesn't know, alone route after route, he'll understand that. He'll understand it the way old dogs understand it, which is the worst way there is. And here's the part your manifest doesn't have a column for, Administrator." I took a step toward him. "The second he's afraid, he stops working. You know that. Sash told me you all know that. The whole thing only runs because nobody asks him for it. You make him an asset, you make him perform, you put him on a schedule and a rotation and a quota, and he'll smell the need on the room and the room will smell the effort on him, and exceptional anchor turns into one more frightened old animal in a metal box. You won't be deploying an anchor. You'll be breaking one. And it'll be the last one you ever break because there's exactly one of him and he doesn't come twice." Reln was very still. The Threnin Fleet colors had gone still too, but it was a different stillness. It was listening. "You are sentimental," Reln said, "about a commodity." "I'm correct," I said, "about a dog. Ask your own science. Ask the people who wrote your accord. They didn't make it a law that an anchor can't be taken because they were soft, Administrator. They made it a law because every time somebody like you tried to take one and use it hard, it stopped working, and people died in the dark who'd have lived. The accord isn't mercy. It's a lesson you already paid for once. I'm just the man telling you not to pay for it again." Reln didn't answer me right away. He looked past me at the dog, and I'll give him this much. Something in him was working on it. Some part of him that wasn't pure manifest. But administrators are administrators, and after a moment the stillness settled back over him and I knew the working hadn't won. "The accord," he said, "is old. Accords are amended. I did not come to debate the matter with you, Mr. Voss. I came as a courtesy to inform you. The authority's interest in securing the deep crossings outweighs one keeper's attachment, and the legal instrument permitting reclassification of an idle anchor in the public interest is already drafted. I had hoped you would see reason and accept the compensation. Since you will not," he turned toward the door, "the order will issue regardless. I would suggest you say your goodbyes. And here is the part of the story I'd least believe if somebody told it to me, so I understand if you don't believe it either, but I was there and I'm telling you it happened exactly like this." Marbles woke up, not because anybody called him. He woke up the way he always woke up, on his own private schedule, because the warm strip of light had moved a hand's width along the floor and was no longer falling on him, and a beagle who has lost his sunbeam does the one thing beagles do, which is he gets up to go find it. He unfolded, front first, the long stretch, the rear in the air, the squeaking yawn, and he ambled out from under the vent into the middle of the diner, sniffing, following the light, and the path of the light took him directly across the floor to where Administrator Relin was standing with his hand out toward the door. Relin froze. I'd seen the Velt go still before, in the concourse 60 at a time, a wave of it. I'd never watched it happen to one Velt up close, alone, with no alarm sounding and nothing to be afraid of, just a man in a good suit and an old dog crossing a quiet room. But it happened to Relin exactly the same way, that full body lock, the swivel of the head down, the wide lidless eyes, finding the small gray animal, and his hand, the one extended toward the door, the one that was going to issue the order, came down slowly to his side and stopped. Marbles reached him. The light had pooled right at the toe of the administrator's expensive boot, and Marbles walked into it, turned around twice, and sat down on the man's foot. Then he looked up at Reln with the open, faintly hopeful, food-suspecting expression that had broken a stampede twice, and he wagged his tail once across the floor, and he leaned the warm gray weight of himself against the administrator's leg and let out the long, settling sigh of a dog who has found his spot. Nobody moved. The two aides had gone still. The Thren in fleet colors had gone still. And Administrator Reln stood there in the middle of my diner with the squandered idle commodity sitting on his foot and leaning on his shin, and I watched something happen on a Velt face that I'd only ever seen on Sasha's down by the floor. The day he apologized, I watched the manifest lose. He didn't bend down. His legs don't work that way, and I think also he didn't trust himself to. He stood very still, and he looked down at the old dog leaning on him, and after a long moment he said, in a voice the translator carried but couldn't flatten all the way, "It is not afraid of me." "No," I said. "He's not afraid of anything. That's the whole point of him. You sit so yourself." "It chose to sit on me," Reln said, and there was something coming apart in the words, some certainty I'd watched him carry in the door now visibly failing him. Of all the room. It crossed the entire room and it sat on me. "He followed the sunbeam," I said, because I wasn't going to let even this be a miracle. "There's no more to it than that. He's not telling you anything. He's an old dog and you happen to be standing in his light." I came over, slow, and crouched down next to them and put my hand on Marble's back and felt the slow even idle of him, unbothered, leaning on a man who'd come to take him away and not knowing or caring that he'd done it. "But I'll tell you what you can take from it, if you want to take something. You came in here to inform me that you were going to put this dog on a rotation through the worst dark in the sector because the math says he's being wasted on a coffee line. And he just walked across the room with no idea who you are and went to sleep on your foot. That's what he is, Administrator. That's the whole of him. He finds the warm spot and he sits in it and he isn't afraid, and that's not a thing you can deploy. It's a thing you can only ruin. You felt it just now. Whatever it was you felt when he stopped you in your tracks, that's what your deep crossings need, and the instant you put it on a manifest, it's gone." Relin left without issuing his order. He didn't say he wouldn't. He didn't say anything much at all. He eased his foot out from under the dog with a care I wouldn't have credited him with on the way in, and Marbles grumbled and resettled in the warm spot without waking properly, and the administrator straightened his good suit and looked at the dog a moment longer, and then walked out, his aides trailing, his Thren a step behind. The Thren stopped at the door. He turned around, armored, blunt, the kind of presence that fills a doorway, and he looked at me and then at the dog, and he said, "In the gravel the translator gave them, I rode the rim crossings for 30 years. Before the posting here." He paused. Thren don't waste words. And I'd never heard one volunteer a personal thing. There was an anchor on the ship of my second crossing, an old thing. It died over the route, midway, and we made the rest of the run without it, 11 days sealed. And I watched what the Velt became in those 11 days, and I have never gotten the smell of it out of my memory. He looked at the sleeping dog. "The administrator will not issue the order. I will see to it that he does not because of the accord." He turned to go. "Because I have made that crossing without an anchor, and I would not put a living thing through a fraction of it, no matter what the math on the manifest says. Keep your dog warm, keeper." And he was gone. That was the end of the realm business. No order ever came. I heard, later secondhand, that the administrator had quietly withdrawn the drafted instrument and recommended against any future reclassification of a domiciled anchor, citing, and I treasure this, stability concerns inherent to the deployment of a unit whose function depends on the absence of function, which is a Velt administrator's way of saying you cannot make a dog work by needing him to. It took him a desk and a title and a near disaster to learn the thing I'd known since I was a boy with my first hound, but he learned it, and that's more than most. You'd think that would be the climax of the whole business. The threat, the standoff, the dog who sat on the right foot at the right moment. But the truth is the standoff with Realm was never really the danger, because there was a Thren in the room who'd ridden the dark, and a whole accord behind him, and a species that already knew. The real test of what Marbles was came later, and it came from the one quarter that hadn't gotten the message, the young. There's a fleet academy 2 stations down the route, and the academy sends its cadets through tertian on training crossings, and cadets are cadets in every species the galaxy has ever produced, which is to say they're certain, and they're loud, and they have not yet been frightened by anything that mattered. A clutch of them came through one afternoon, fresh Velt cadets in crisp uniforms, on a layover, and they found the diner, and they found the famous dog, and they thought the whole thing was hilarious. I heard them before I saw them. The translator gave me fragments, the calming asset, one of them said, in the bright sneering register that translates across every species, the legendary anchor, look at it, it's asleep, it's drooling, my grandmother is more formidable. And there was a chorus of the clicking laugh, and one of them, the loud one, the one there's always one of, came swaggering up to the vent where Marbles slept and stood over him with his hands on his narrow hips. This, the cadet announced to his friends, is what saved 200 people, this? He nudged the edge of Marbles' bedding with the toe of his boot. Not the dog, he wasn't fool enough or cruel enough for that. But close, the gesture of contempt. It's a sack of fur. I have been in the SEAL drills. I held my composure. We are trained to hold composure. And you are telling me that this grandfather of a creature does by sleeping what we do by discipline. He looked around at his friends for the laugh and got it. Earth sends us a drooling sack of fur and calls it a master of the killing state. It is an insult. It is propaganda. I will not be afraid in a sealed room and then be told a dog is braver than I am. I came around the counter. I wasn't angry. Exactly, he was 19 or whatever the Velt equivalent is, and I'd been a loud certain young man in a uniform once and said things just as stupid. But I wasn't going to have him standing over my dog. I was working out how to move him along without making a scene when Sash, who'd been at the counter end with his off-shift brine grain, set down his cup. Cadet, Sash said. The young one turned, ready to be defiant, and then saw the customs insignia and the gray at the edges of Sash's frame and reconsidered his posture by a few degrees. Sir, you held your composure in the drills, Sash said. I am glad you will need it. He stood slowly, and he was old enough and senior enough that the cadets went quiet. I have read your file. No, do not look surprised. I read all of them. It is my desk you came through. You are rated highly. You held composure through every sealed drill in your training. Do you know what a drill is, cadet? He didn't wait. A drill is a sealed room in which everyone present knows, in the deepest part of themselves, that they are not going to die. That is the only difference between a drill and the thing itself, and it is the entire difference. Your composure has never once been tested against a room that believed it was dying. Mine has, twice, in this concourse. And I will tell you what I learned both times, which is that there is no composure, there is no discipline. When the true signal sounds and the doors come down and the oldest part of you takes the wheel, your training is a leaf in that flood, and you go where the flood takes you, and the flood takes everyone, and it takes them onto the floor and over the small ones. He let that sit. I went into the state both times, cadet. I who am rated higher than you will ever be. And do you know what brought me back both times? When nothing in me could. The cadet didn't answer. That sack of fur, Sash said quietly, asleep under the vent. So before you stand over him and call him propaganda, I would have you pray, very sincerely, to whatever you pray to, that you never meet the true signal in a sealed room. Because if you do, cadet, and you survive it, it will be because of exactly this, a creature too old and too content to be afraid, who got up off his warm spot and walked into your terror and gave you back your mind. And you will spend the rest of your life, as I have, trying to find the words to thank a thing that does not know it did anything at all. The cadet stood there with the laugh gone off his face and his friends very quiet behind him. And for a moment I thought he was going to do the young thing, dig in, defend the position out of pride. He had it in him. I could see it. But Marbles, who'd slept through the whole lecture, picked that moment to wake up and roll onto his side with a groan and a wet snuffle, and he blinked up at the ring of stiff young uniforms around his vent with his one bad ear flopped inside out, and he thumped his tail twice on the deck. Not at anyone, just a general greeting to the morning, to the warm light, to the large new presences who might conceivably have food, and the loud cadet looked down at him, at the gray muzzle and the inside-out ear and the slow indifferent wag, and something in him let go. He crouched, carefully the way they all did, the joints folding down. He didn't touch the dog. He held a hand out low the way you do, and Marbles considered it for a second, and then leaned over and gave it the long ceremonial sniff, jowls swinging, And the cadet went absolutely still, not the killing state stillness, a different one. The stillness of a young man feeling a thing he has no category for. I watched it move through him. I'd watched it move through 60 of them in a stampede, and through Reln on his expensive boot, and through Sosh down by the floor, and here it was again in a 19-year-old who'd come in to mock. The smell of a calm so total and so genuine that the oldest part of the brain unclenches in spite of itself and says, without permission, "It's all right, you're all right. Nothing here is dying." "Oh," the cadet said. Very softly, the translator almost didn't catch it. "Oh, yeah," I said. He stayed crouched there a while. His friends drifted in around him, all the swagger gone, and they took turns holding their hands out low for the sniff. And Marbles received them one by one with his enormous patience, and nobody said anything clever. When they finally got up to go catch their crossing, the loud one stopped at the counter and worked his long fingers the way Sosh did when something was hard. "I will not forget this," he said. What I said. I will not forget that I said it. He looked back at the vent. "If I ever ride a crossing with an anchor aboard, I will know now what I am riding with. And if I ever ride one without," he stopped. "Thank you for keeping him warm," he said, which I gathered was becoming a kind of formula on the route. A thing the Velt said to me now in place of all the things that wouldn't fit in words, and then he left, and I never saw him again, though I think about him sometimes when a young, loud, certain one comes through, and I hope the crossing he was so sure he could discipline his way across turned out to have an old dog asleep on it somewhere. It changed, after that, the way the young ones came in. Word got back to the academy the way word does, and the cadets that came through Tertian after stopped coming to laugh. They came the way the freighter pilots came, quiet, to sit in the radius and breathe and store up an hour of it against the dark ahead, except the cadets were storing it against a dark they hadn't met yet, which is its own kind of brave, to prepare for a terror you've only been told about. I'd watch them at the vent, these certain young creatures learning to be afraid of the right thing in advance. Sitting still beside an old dog who'd never been afraid of anything in his life, and I thought there were worse classrooms. Sosh told me, around then, that the academy had quietly added a thing to the curriculum. Not a class exactly, a practice. The SEAL drill instructors had always taught composure, hold the line, master the breath, discipline the killing state, and they still taught it because you teach what you can teach. But they'd begun to add at the end a thing they hadn't said before, which was, and if your composure fails, as it may, as it has failed every Velt who ever met the true signal, do not despair, because you may not be alone in the room. Listen for the calm that is not your own. There may be an anchor. There may be an old creature that is not afraid. Find it. Go toward it. It will give you back what you lost. We taught them for 1,000 years that the killing state was theirs to master, Sosh said. That to be taken by it was a failure of the self. And it broke them, that teaching, because it cannot be mastered, and a creature taught it must be mastered hates itself when it cannot. He turned his cup slowly. Your dog has done a thing your dog will never know it did. It has let us tell our young a different story, that the calm does not have to come from inside you, that it is permitted to be saved, that there is no shame in being the one who is held, only in refusing to hold. He looked at me. We did not have that story before. We had only the shame. You brought it to us asleep under a grill vent, on an old animal you almost left behind, and you did not even know you were carrying it. I've thought a lot about that, being held. I came out here a man who'd spent a life being the one who held the line, the uniform, the counter, the steady hand in the bad hour, and somewhere along the way I decided that was the only way to be of use, that you earned your place by being the one nobody had to worry about. Out here with the diner and the dog, I learned different, and I learned it from watching giants line up to sit beside an old beagle and be told, by the unhurried fact of him, that it was allowed to need that the strong thing isn't to never be afraid. The strong thing is to be the calm somebody else can come toward when they are. People started writing to me too, once the story spread far enough down the route. Not officials, ordinary travelers, mostly, who'd come through Tertian and sat at the vent and gone on, and who wanted me to know, weeks or months later, what the hour by the dog had done for them. A Velt freight clerk who'd dreaded a transfer for years and made it easy for the first time. A loon broker who said she'd stopped flinching at sealed lifts. A whole crossing's worth of passengers who'd heard there was an anchor at Tertian and arranged their layovers, just so, to give themselves a morning in the diner before the deep run, and who swore the run went gentler for it. I kept the messages in a drawer behind the counter, and on the slow nights I'd take them out and read a few, and then I'd look over at the gray heap of dog snoring under the vent, the cause of all of it, who had never read a word in his life and never would, and I'd put the messages back in the drawer and let him sleep. There wasn't any point telling him. He'd have wanted to know only one thing about any of it, which is whether it came with food, And the answer was no, and so he'd have gone back to sleep, which is exactly what he was already doing. Marbles was never afraid. I want to be careful here, because I've said that a dozen ways, and I don't want it to sound like a virtue, like courage. It wasn't courage. Courage is what you have when you're afraid and act anyway, and Marbles never had the first thing to be courageous about, because the alarm meant nothing to him, and the giants meant nothing to him, and the sealed dark 1,000 light years deep meant nothing to him. He had his vent, his counter, his man, his protein, the occasional walk, and a thrown ball once that he'd carried around for a week. The whole apparatus of cosmic terror that ran the Velt nervous system simply did not exist in his 14-year-old skull. And that absence, that perfect uncluttered indifference, turned out to be the rarest and most valuable thing on the whole deep route, a thing 1,000 years of desperate science couldn't manufacture. Because the moment you try to make a creature calm, the trying poisons it. You can't breed for it. You can't train it. You can't deploy it. You can only, if you're very lucky and a little stubborn and you refuse to do the kind thing the manifest recommends, bring it out into the dark with you because it's yours and it's old and you love it and discover, years later, what you were carrying. The days settled into a shape after a while. The fuss died down the way fuss does. The deliveries kept coming, the good protein, and once a quarter a crate of something nice from the Velt agricultural concern with the folded note. And the fees stayed waived, and the sitters kept their stools, and the route learned to be quiet around the vent, the way you learn to be quiet near. Anything sacred you don't fully understand. I cooked, I served the brine grain the way the Velt liked it. I let an old dog sleep in a moving strip of warm light, and I moved his bedding twice a day to follow it, because he was too old by then to chase the sun the way he used to, and it seemed the least I could do for the keeper of the root's peace, to bring the warm spot to him. He got slower that last year. They do. The stairs at the back went from a thing he grumbled at to a thing he couldn't do, so I carried him, and the long evening unfold got longer and creakier, and he slept more. 22 hours now of every 28, then 23. The Velt who came to sit with him got gentler about it, if that was possible, and quieter, and I noticed they'd started to leave a little more space. The way you do around an old thing you can see is closer to the far door than the near one. Sash came every day toward the end. He'd sit at the vent with his off-shift cup and not say much, and Marbles would lift his head and give him the one slow wag and put it back down. And Sash would stay until his next shift, and on his way out he'd put his terrible wide head down level with the dog, the way he had the first day, and make the soft clicking question sound, and Marbles would receive it with his enormous patience, and Sash would go back to his desk and process the manifests, the long list of every living thing that crossed through Tertian, each one sorted into its category, labor, cargo, hazard, drain, and I have wondered since whether he ever again wrote surplus weight on any line of any manifest as long as he held that desk. I doubt it. I think a man learns a thing like that exactly once. There's a stretch of all this I've skipped, and I shouldn't, because it's the part that made me understand the dog wasn't just a tool the Velt had been missing. That what he did reached further than their one, nightmare, into corners nobody had thought to look. It started with the vet, but it didn't end there, and I think the vet is the place to start, only because she was the first one to say out loud what the rest of them had been circling. The Velt knew what the dog did for the killing state. They'd needed him for that for 1,000 years. What none of them had reckoned for was that the calm wasn't keyed to their one nightmare at all. It wasn't a remedy for the sealed room dread specifically. It was just calm, old, total, indifferent calm, and calm, it turns out, is the universal solvent. It works on every fear there is, and every species that has one, because every fear in the galaxy is the same fear underneath, and the same old dog dissolves all of them by the simple fact of not sharing them. Tertian has a station veterinarian, a Velt named Oath, who handles the working animals. The freight haulers draft beasts, the security thrends hunting stock, the occasional earth pet passing through. And a few weeks after the second alarm, when it was clear Marbles was going to be a permanent feature of the concourse, the Port Authority asked, very politely, whether Oath might examine him. Make sure the asset was healthy, was how the request was phrased, and I bristled at the word asset the way I always did. But I also wanted to know how the old man's heart was holding up out here in the deep, so I said yes. Oath came to the diner. I wouldn't take Marbles to a clinic. The stress of it wasn't worth whatever they'd learn. She was younger than Sash, quicker in her movements, and she came in carrying a case of instruments and an attitude I recognized from human vets, that brisk professional confidence of someone who handles frightened animals all day and has stopped being impressed by any of them. She knelt by the vent, folded down rather, and she opened her case and reached for the dog with the efficient hands of someone about to do a job, and I opened my mouth to tell her he didn't always take kindly to strangers' handling, and then I closed it, because something was happening to Otha. She'd gotten close enough to smell him. I watched the briskness go out of her the way it went out of all of them, that loosening through the long frame, the wide eyes going soft. Her reaching hand slowed and settled on his side without any of the clinical efficiency it had started with, just rested there, rising and falling with his slow old breathing, and she went very still and very quiet and stayed that way for a long moment before she remembered herself. "I have examined 10,000 animals," she said after, in a voice that hadn't quite found its professional register again. "Frightened ones, dangerous ones, dying ones. I have never once in my career touched a creature and felt." She stopped. "My hands do not shake when I work. They shook just now, not from fear, from the absence of it. He is so unafraid that it reaches into me through my fingers." She withdrew her hand slowly, as if it cost her something. "I understand now what the report meant. I did not before. I thought it was sentiment. The talk of anchors. It is not sentiment. I have it in my own hand still, the quiet of him." She examined him properly after that, gentle as anything, and pronounced him a very old dog with a tired heart and good years left in him if I kept him warm and unbothered, which I intended to do regardless. But before she packed her case, she sat back on her folded joints and looked at him a while longer, and she said a thing I've kept. "We bring animals to a vet because they are afraid and in pain and cannot understand why we hurt them. To help them," she said. "It is the hardest part of my work, the fear in them, the way they fight the very hands trying to save them. I have wished 10,000 times for an animal that would simply be calm and let me work." She looked at Marbles, asleep again already, the examination already forgotten by him entirely. "And here he is, the calmest creature I have ever touched. And the joke of it, Mr. Voss, the joke I will be a long time getting over, is that he is calm not because he trusts me, not because he understands I mean him well. He is calm because he has not got the faintest idea anything is happening at all. He slept through his own examination. The thing I have wished for my entire career turns out to be simply a dog too old and too content to notice the world. There is a lesson in that, and I do not think I like it." She started bringing her difficult cases by after that. Not to use him, she was careful about that, she'd read the same reports. She knew the calm couldn't be made to perform, but a frightened draft beast due for a procedure, brought through the concourse past the vent on its way to her clinic, would catch the smell of the old dog and steady, just a little, just enough, and go on to her table easier than it would have. She never billed me, and I never asked her to stop. It seemed like exactly the right use of him, which is to say no use at all, just an old calm thing existing in a warm spot, while the frightened of the galaxy filed past and took what they needed from his indifference and left him sleeping. The other thing I skipped is the child. I've been working up to it the way Sash works up to a hard thing, folding and unfolding, because it's the one that still gets me. There was a Velt family that came through Tertian on a relocation, mother and father and a small one, a Velt child, which I'd never seen up close, all the same pale segmented length as the adults, but in miniature, gangly and uncertain on the long feet, the wide eyes too big for the narrow head. They were riding out to the rim, the deep crossings, the routes with no anchors, and they'd heard about the diner, and they came in not to sit and breathe like the others, but with a specific desperate purpose. I didn't understand until the mother explained it, her fingers working the whole time. The child had the dread bad, worse than bad. Some of them are born with it turned up too high, she told me. The killing state, nearer the surface, set off by less, a closing door, a dim corridor, a room without a clear exit. And their child was one of those, had been since hatching, and the crossing ahead of them was 11 sealed days through the worst dark on the route, and they did not know, the mother said, her voice coming apart under the translator, they did not know if their child would survive it. Not the danger of the crossing, the dread of it. 11 days sealed for a child whose nervous system met every closed door as death. They'd delayed the relocation twice already. They could not delay it again, and they'd come, on the slim hope the stories were true, to ask whether the famous old Earth animal might do something, anything, for their child before they had to carry it into the dark. I didn't know what to tell them. I'm a cook. I told them they could sit with them. That's all I had. That's all anyone had. And the mother set the child down near the vent with the careful dread of a parent handling something fragile, and the child took one look at the strange new place, and the strange new giant, and the closing and the doors, and went straight toward the killing state, the small body locking up, the first thread of that low moan starting in its chest. And Marbles woke up. He'd slept through alarms and administrators and a vet's examination, but he woke up for the child, and I've never been able to explain that either, except that maybe an old dog who spent a life around people knows the particular sound a small frightened thing makes, and answers it from somewhere deeper than the rest. He got his old legs under him, the slow unfold, and he padded over to the locked-up child, and he did not sit at a polite distance the way he received the adults. He walked right up to the small shaking Velt, and he leaned the whole warm gray weight of himself against it, the way he'd leaned on Reln's leg, and he let out the long settling sigh of a dog who has found his spot, and he stayed. The moan died in the child's throat with that audible click I knew. The locked frame loosened. The wide, too big eyes came down and found the old dog leaning on it, breathing slow, supremely unbothered, asleep again already against the child's side, and I watched a creature born into a lifetime of dread learn, maybe for the first time, the thing Sasha's whole people had needed 1,000 years to be told, that the closed room was not death, because here was a small ancient creature sleeping in it without a care. And if the old one wasn't afraid, then maybe, the dark was survivable after all. The mother made a sound I won't try to describe. The father folded all the way down to the floor. They stayed 3 days. Their crossing held for them, and they kept delaying it, and the authority, for once, let them. And the child sat with the dog every one of those days and learned the shape of his calm, breathed it in, stored it, and when they finally had to go, the mother asked me, and this is the part that gets me, whether they might take something of his. Not him. They'd never have asked for him. Something of his. So I gave them his old spare bedding, the blanket he'd slept on before I got him the new one, that smelled of him through and through, and the mother received it like a relic and folded it small and held it against the child. And the child held it the rest of the time I could see them, all the way to the gate. Sash told me, months later, that he'd had word down the route. The family made the crossing. 11 sealed days through the deep dark, and the child made it. The child who they hadn't known would survive the dread of it. Made it curled up the whole way around an old earth dog's blanket, breathing the last ghost of a calm that asked nothing and gave everything, and never knew it had given anything at all. They named the child's first solo berth after him, Sash said, after Marbles. There is a bunk on a rim route freighter named for my surplus weight, and a small Velt who is alive to sleep in it because of an old beagle who got up off his warm spot one more time for a frightened child the way he always did, the way he never knew he did. I had to go in the back when Sash told me that. I was a long time in the back. There was one more alarm. I'll tell it because it's the one that taught me the last thing, and then I'll be done. Before I do, I should say a word about how the station changed its own bones over those 2 years, because that's the part that tells you the Velt meant it. They didn't just wave my fees and bow at the dog and call it done. Somewhere in the second year, the crossing authority quietly rewrote the sealed compartment protocols for the whole sector. Every doctrine I'd watched them argue over in those endless meetings Sash would come in exhausted from, and the rewrite did a thing their 1,000 years of science never had. It stopped treating the killing state as a flaw in the individual to be drilled out, and started treating it as a condition of the room to be answered. Sealed compartments on the deep routes were ordered, where it could be managed, to carry an anchor. Ships without one were flagged and rerouted. The old breeding programs got real funding again, and a quiet directive went out to find and protect every calm old beast in the sector the way Tertian protected mine. None of it was named for the dog. The Velt are too formal for that. But Sash told me the last week before he retired that every line of that rewrite traced back to a single afternoon when a coolant sensor faulted and an old earth animal got up off his warm spot and went and sat down in the middle of the room. A whole sector's worth of doctrine redrawn because of a nap. I've never decided whether that's the most absurd thing I've ever heard or the most reasonable. Probably both. Most true things are. It came in the deep of that final year when Marbles was the slowest he'd ever been. 23 hours of sleep and a body gone light and frail under my hands. A maintenance crew tripped a containment seal in the gallery doing routine work, a false alarm, the bored steady tone again, no real danger anywhere. But the concourse was full, and it was a Velt-heavy hour, and the doors came down, and the drone started up before the station could get the all-clear out. And I looked over at the vent, and I made a decision I'd never had to make before, because before, he'd always gotten up on his own. This time he didn't. The tone wasn't enough to reach his old sleep, or the killing state scent in the air meant nothing to a dog whose own nervous system had never had a killing state in it, and he just slept on, light and gray and far away, while the concourse outside my door began to come apart. I could have left him. He was old and frail, and I'd sworn nobody would ever make him work, that the whole thing only ran on him never being needed. And here the room needed him, and that was exactly the thing that was supposed to break it. But I'd also stood in 2 stampedes, and I knew what was about to happen to the small ones on that deck. And I made the keeper's choice, which is the choice you swear you'll never have to make and then make anyway. I gathered him up off his bedding, as gentle as I've ever handled anything, and I carried him out into the concourse, not held over my head this time, just cradled against my chest, his old heart idling slow under my palm, dead asleep through all of it. and I walked him into the drone. Here's the thing I learned. It still worked. It worked because he was asleep. The veld nearest us caught the smell of him, an ancient creature so deep in untroubled sleep that a death signal couldn't even wake him. The absolute zero of fear, calm past calm, calm all the way down to the bottom, and they stopped. Of course they stopped. There is no greater proof that a sealed room is not death than a frail old animal sleeping through the alarm in it. The wave went out the way it always did, the drone broke, the breathing came back, and the all clear sounded a minute later, and I'd never once woken him. He slept through the whole rescue. He'd done the most important thing of his life without opening his eyes, and he'd have been outraged at the very suggestion that he'd done anything at all besides nap, which is, I think, the entire and final secret of him. It only worked because to him it was never work. The room found its peace in him precisely because he had not the faintest interest in giving it. I carried him back. I sat down on the floor by the vent with him still in my lap, and Sash came over and folded down beside us, and we didn't say anything for a while. You broke your own rule, Sash said finally. You let him be needed. He was asleep, I said. He never knew. That's not the same as making him work. I looked down at him, the gray muzzle, the inside-out ear, the slow idle of the old engine. And I'll tell you the truth, Sash, I'd have done it, even if it cost me the whole arrangement. I'd have carried him into 100 of those before I'd have stood in my doorway and watched a child go down on that deck. The rule was never that he can't be needed. The rule is that he can't be made to try. There's daylight between those, and a man learns to live in it. He's still here, my surplus weight. Older now, slower than ever, mostly sleep, and the occasional grumble, and once a day on a good day, the long creaking unfold and a slow turn around the bedding before he settles again. I don't carry him into the concourse anymore. There hasn't been an alarm in a while, and I'd rather there never were. And if one comes, I'll make the keeper's choice again and live in the daylight of it. But mostly there's no alarm. Mostly there's just the diner, and the brine grain, and the moving strip of warm light I shift his bedding through twice a day, and the quiet sitters at the vent who come off the long crossings to store up an hour of his peace. The routes changed around him, the way a place changes around a thing it's decided to protect. The young ones don't laugh anymore. The administrators don't come with good suits and drafted orders. The deliveries arrive, the fees stay waived, and twice now a veld has come through Tertian on a deep crossing, recognized the diner from the stories, and asked, very carefully, with their long fingers folding, whether they might bring their own anchor in to sit beside mine for an afternoon, some old beast off their ship, the slow-bred for it kind, and I've said yes every time, and watched two ancient unbothered creatures sleep side by side in the warm light while a whole concourse of the galaxy's most frightened travelers walked past on tiptoe, and I've thought that if there's a heaven for the deep route, it probably looks a great deal like that. Sash retired last month. He came in on his last day with his off-shift cup one final time, and he sat at the vent, and he put his terrible wide head down level with the dog the way he had the first morning, 2 years and a lifetime ago, and he made the soft clicking question sound, and Marbles lifted his gray head and gave him the one slow considering wag and leaned over and sniffed, his face, jowls swinging, and put his head back down. And Stosh stayed there a long time by the floor with the old dog, and when he finally got up to go, he stopped at the counter and worked his fingers and said the thing the route says to me now, the formula that holds everything that won't fit in words. Thank you, he said, for keeping him warm. I've turned that phrase over a lot of slow nights. It started as a thing they said because the real thing wouldn't fit, and then somewhere along the way I understood it was the real thing, that there wasn't a bigger one hiding behind it. Keeping him warm is the whole job. Not deploying him, not managing him, not extracting the calm and bottling it, and spraying it through the vents on the deep routes where it's needed. Just feeding an old dog and sheltering him and moving his bedding into the sun twice a day and asking him for nothing ever, and letting the thing he is sit quietly in the middle of a frightened galaxy and do, by doing nothing, what no fleet and no doctrine and no 1,000 years of desperate science ever managed. The veld looked for the answer in their labs and their breeding pens and their drilled composure for longer than my whole species has had writing, and the answer, when it came, asked only to be kept warm. I think that's the part they'll be the longest getting over. I think it's the part I'll be the longest getting over too. I think about the personnel officer sometimes, the human one, back on the Earth side, with his form and his math and his gentle advice to do the kind thing and leave the old dog behind. He wasn't a cruel man. He was a correct man by the only measure he had. The math doesn't work, he told me, and he was right. The math has never worked and never will, because the math can weigh what a thing costs you to carry, and has not got one column anywhere on the whole manifest for what it turns out to be, worth once you've carried it into the dark. I logged my dog as a dependent on an intake form 2 years ago, and a vet logged him as surplus weight, and we were both in our way, trying to put a 14-year-old beagle into a box that would tell us what he was. Neither box held him. He isn't cargo, and he isn't a drain, and he isn't, whatever the Accord says, an asset or an anchor or a calming auxiliary unit. He's an old dog who likes the warm spot and isn't afraid of anything, and that turned out to be the rarest cargo on the route. The one thing 1,000 years in a whole sector full of frightened giants couldn't make for themselves. And I had it asleep under a grill vent the entire time, and I almost left it behind because a careful man with a clipboard told me the kind thing to do. It's evening now. The light's gone long and gold through the concourse glass, and it's crept all the way across the floor to the far wall, and the warm strip under the vent has moved off his bedding, so in a minute, if it's a good day, he'll get up to go find it. The slow front first unfold, the long stretch with the rear in the air, the squeaking yawn, and amble off across the floor after the last of the sun, the way he's done every evening of the strangest 2 years of my life. I'll move his bedding into the light for him before he gets there. I always do. It's the least a keeper can do, to bring the warm spot to the thing that brought the whole route its peace and never knew it brought anything at all. He's not for sale. I'll say it one more time for the manifest. He's not cargo, he's not a drain, he's not an asset, he's a good dog. That's the whole of it. He always was.